Hello, class. Today we are learning about the brain. We are going to look at the brain's physiology, and we're mostly just going to have a general overview on the main parts and functions of the of the physiology of the brain. So first of all, let us look at the cerebrum. So here is our brain, okay? Now, a large portion of our brain is consisted of the cerebrum. The cerebrum, along the brainstem and the cerebellum, are the major areas of the brain. The cerebrum is responsible for four main functions and more, but we're just going to look at the four main functions. This is responsible for basically processing information coming from our general senses. So when we touch something, to our special senses, which are basically stimuli coming from our eyes or ears, so our auditory or visual cortex interpretation. It is also responsible it is also responsible for initiating and controlling skeletal muscle movements. So when your legs move, and in order to coordinate those skeletal muscle movements through the innervation of nerves to muscles, or skeletal muscles in this case, it will be processed here on the cerebrum, not cerebellum, cerebrum. The cerebrum basically have motor areas and basal nuclei to process and initiate control on those skeletal muscles. The cerebrum is also responsible for memory and intellect. So when you are studying, when you're learning something, the cerebrum is responsible for that. Information is also relayed to different parts of the brain or the spinal cord through the association, commissural, and projection tracts here at the cerebrum. Okay, now let us look at the brainstem. So this is the brainstem. So like a tree, it's like a stem. The brainstem is responsible for maintaining life-sustaining processes. So basically, when you're in a coma, your cerebrum, remember, for memory and intellect, is the one that generally shut down, and the brainstem is the one that's still working. Okay, so that's generally what happens when you're in a coma. The brainstem is still working. The cerebrum, maybe not as much because you're in a coma. But as long as your brainstem is working, you can breathe, you can pump blood, etc., etc. Now, the brainstem is quite complicated, so we're going to look at this in a very simplistic approach. Okay? Please don't get overwhelmed. So the brainstem, so we're zooming in here to this, is composed of three main parts. Okay? This is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, or just the medulla of the brainstem. The midbrain, which is at the top here, is responsible for processing auditory or visual reflexes. So when there is danger or when there's some sort of dust, you are able to process those sensory stimuli through the midbrain. So this allows eye movements, or head or neck in response to stimuli. If there is, let's say, you see something and you want to look closer, it's going to allow for those neck movements as an automatic response, unless you're in a coma, obviously. Pons is then responsible for working with the medulla, which is this other component of the brainstem, in order to regulate our breathing. So this is very essential for our survival as a species, as a human. The pons has these pontine respiratory center that is responsible for regulating the breathing. We then have the medulla oblongata, which has arrays of various other functional regions, as physiologists would call it. So this has the decussization on crossing and sensory motor tracts. What this region does, this functional region does, is it allows to control the skeletal muscles by allowing, let's say, the left side of the brain. So let's say this is the brain. So the left side of this brain, so let's say over here, this brain. So the left side of this brain allows to control, let's say, the right skeletal muscle. In other words, if you want to control a skeletal muscle, through decussization and crossing of sensory of motor tracts, this functional region will do it for you. Let's say you then have the autonomic vital reflex. The autonomic vital reflex centers is responsible for two major things: the respiratory area, which allows to, it allows you to breathe. So that's why we said that the pons works with the medulla, specifically working with this to regulate our breathing through the pontine respiratory center. We also then have the cardiovascular center, which is responsible to having the cardiac areas and the vasomotor area. Now, this cardiac area is responsible for regulating our heart rate. Okay? And the vasomotor area is then responsible for controlling the blood vessel diameter. So if you want more blood going through a specific capillary, because let's say there's a lack of oxygen in there, you will have the vasomotor area trying to basically control the blood vessel diameter. We then have the other areas of our functional regions for our medulla. So this includes for swallowing, vomiting, coughing, sneezing, etc. and etc. So I hope that gives some sort of idea what the brainstem and the cerebrum does. The next video we are going to look at the hypothalamus.